We are going to kick off the second half of our community forum this morning with an extremely dynamic speaker, a friend of PBGH and a friend of our community. Shane Wolverton will present on the emergent evolution of quality assessment for Pittsburgh employers. So a very customized presentation, I would say, that goes through the evolution of our relationship here in our marketplace and trends that are going on throughout the country. So thank you, Shane. We look forward to your presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Do you guys like the voice? It's pretty husky, huh? It's kind of like Kathleen Turner. For those of you old enough to know Kathleen Turner. My apologies. I was in Montana last week, and there were a bunch of families on their way back from Thanksgiving holidays. I think one of the tykes caught me. So I named this presentation because I wanted to use the word emergent, and just kidding. What we're going to talk about today are, I think is going to dovetail nicely with what Rick talked about, and that is that we focus a lot on cost and things that are controllable or potentially controllable on the employer side. But when we move to quality, quality becomes this big squishy thing, right, that we don't really know how to get our arms around it because we have so many different sources of truth. We have so many different indicators, and I know as employers, unless you're a dork like me, it's very hard to kind of cut through the noise. So today, what I'd like to do is really talk about kind of a level set and then beginning to break apart quality and then where we're going with PBGH. So I think you guys have the benefit of one of the organizations in the United States that is very progressive in their vision for where they want to go and actually have the vehicle to get to some of these places that I think hopefully you'll find intriguing. So are you guys all familiar with the Health Research Education Trust? They do an annual survey of employers. Kaiser participates with this. If you guys have not read the summary of this, I would highly recommend it. It encapsulates a tremendous amount of information into something that I feel like is very digestible. So here's what we recognize, and this was released not too long ago for 16. So what this says is that there's been a 58% annual premium increase on the part of employers to underwrite healthcare and a 78% contribution increase on the part of workers over the last 10 years. Now, I'm not a finance guy, but my dad taught me about the rule of 72, right? Which is the rule of 72 is your what? It doubles, so your interest doubles, or whether you're paying interest out or receiving it. So if you kind of look broadly at the numbers, so the survey reflected 147 million employees across both large and small employers, but 63% had coverage. Some of that was because they declined coverage because their spouse had coverage, so on and so on. Would you like to guess the difference in annual underwriting on the part of employers from 2006 to 2016? $617 billion a year, annually. Does that scare you? $213 billion a year by employees. Have your employees had a raise in the last 10 years? Not really, because everything that they're making in raises is going to underwrite increase in their healthcare underwriting. Is that not crazy? So think about that. Think about what your EBITDA multiple is if you're an employer and you had access to that cash on the bottom line. Tremendous opportunities to reinvest cash into the company, capitalize equipment, technologies, a lot of things that Rick was talking about that's being wasted or we have no idea what it's going for. And what I'm going to show you today shocks me because I've been doing this for a long time. Even though I look incredibly youthful, I'm actually 53. I've been a full-on dork for 25 years in medical analytics, and I can tell you that I've spoken with employers for years and years and years and years, and you know what? It's the same conversation everywhere for the last 20 years. Guys, we need a checkup from the neck up, okay? Because a lot of what's going on in this market is what you guys have asked for. So I'm going to be a little assertive because I'm a little cranky. No, I'm just kidding. Because the data shows that you're not getting what you think you're getting. And it doesn't matter whether it's UPMC or Highmark, it doesn't matter the hospital. I'm talking about as broad macro trends. I'm going to show you information that I'm aware of, that I've known, that you're going to be made aware of today, and you're going to be able to have a copy of it, that should shock you. And yet what happens is we go away and go, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to be able to do about this. So as part of this report, what they see, which is not a big surprise, is that the percentage of workers that are enrolled in a plan with a deductible of $1,000 or more continues to escalate, and that the percentage of workers in an HDHP or HSA qualified HDHP continues to escalate as well. So here's what we've done. We have increased the annual underwriting of healthcare by about somewhere around $800 billion a year. And we continue to offload some of the costs to our employees, who are now basically self-insured to some extent. And when it comes to quality, we just kind of throw our arms up, right? So we go, well, CMS, or well, this, or well, that. So what I want us to do is to begin to say, if we're going to deal with the finance part of healthcare, we have to deal with the quality part of healthcare as well. Because if we don't have an understanding of the price that we're paying for either drugs or office visits or inpatient healthcare, and understanding the quality, it's impossible to understand the relative value that you guys are getting. So we began a relationship with PBGH in the fall of 2013 and began to share some information that was available through a relationship through now the National Association. And this was beginning to assess hospital quality, and simply it was teasing up that you can actually, in an academically sound way, compare hospitals to each other. Well, we've procured a file that beginning in the next 4 weeks or so, we can actually get to physician-specific detail in measuring composite quality performance on the inpatient side. So now what we're going to be able to do is go below the hospital level performance and begin to understand within a particular hospital, are there physicians, either attending physicians or specialists or surgeons, who are able to achieve better outcomes than their peers, either at the same facility or across different facilities. And none of this is intended to be punitive, but it simply is intended to get a deeper understanding of how we as a community deal with practice pattern variability for a variety of reasons. And so through our relationship with the National Association, we're able to license this content to PBGH and have begun to discuss in earnest plans for how this information might get into your hands as employers for you guys to think about the benefits that you deliver. And then in the future, what we have put in place are actually plans. Now think about this. So a lot of your analysis is claims-based now, correct? So you're kind of pulling in claims and you're doing claims assessment. So you guys are all familiar with HEDIS measures, for example. So if I was a diabetic, did I go in and did I have an A1C? Did I have a foot exam? Did I have a retinal exam? What if I told you that the technology exists today to where your quality assessment of your network no longer has to be claims-based? What if I told you that you could know specifically whether a physician or a physician group or an integrated delivery network was keeping hypertensive patients' blood pressure under control because you have access, or we have access to information directly from their EMR? So that lives today. We're actually collecting that type of information from hospitals as they have to be compliant with CMS. It's called a Qualified Clinical Data Repository or a Health Information Exchange. I'm going to show you this really cool, complex example that you won't understand, but I wanted to show it because I thought it was cool. So when we talk about future, we're not talking about something in the distant future about quality measurement. What we're actually talking about is in the immediate future, the ability to move beyond claims-based analysis of quality that is subject to the vagaries of coding and documentation and other things into something that's very specific about the clinical attributes of a patient and how you can get insight into that. So the path that we've been down for the last 25 years on the employer side has literally been only at the at the hospital level. So it's been very rare unless you have states like Florida or Washington or others that have recently begun to release data in more specificity. But what we're trying to do is, in this path, is at the hospital level, by identifying top quality hospitals using this information, we're trying to change the discussion, right? Which is the presumption of quality being the same everywhere and recognizing that it's actually not. And that what we want is we want to change the discussion with the providers and the plans about performance and then increasing awareness about higher quality care being available. I love what Rick showed about the COE program from Walmart, because the premise was Walmart started with quality. So they picked these centers of excellence based on quality and then went and did direct contracting. How many of you guys have underwritten benefits to direct your employees towards facilities that you believe deliver higher quality? Okay, I see some here, okay? So this is a huge opportunity because it doesn't necessarily mean that your ASO has to do something radical, right? You're just talking about optimizing the network towards providers that you believe deliver quality based on some analytic premise. PBGH actually has information that can be delivered to you that you can work with your various stakeholders around. How do I begin to administrate something that directs me towards higher quality providers? High quality providers exist in the Pittsburgh market and in the surrounding markets here. So why are we excited about top quality? And we're talking about inpatient care here because we're talking about risk-adjusted outcomes. So we're talking about risk-adjusted mortality, risk-adjusted complications of care, adverse patient safety events. We use binary logistic regression models that actually look at the patient's attributes to calculate these things, which I can provide to you. But here's the thing that's exciting. If all we do is we have visibility to the hospital, I have no line of sight to variability with inside care that's being delivered. So what happens is we're making an assumption that if I go to a hospital that we deem as being high quality, that everybody there that delivers care is delivering the same level of performance. The reality is that's not true. JAMA published an article that was very interesting, and it's because we all tend to think that volume correlates with higher quality. And what they found was that volume at the hospital level did not correlate highly with quality. It was volume at the physician level that correlated with higher quality. It's not always the case, but it was higher than what we found in hospitals. So now, starting in January, what we're going to be able to do is expand access to higher quality care, moving beyond facilities, so that you can actually have greater access to higher quality outcomes regardless of potentially where the hospital is potential. Does that make sense? Is that exciting? I think it's very exciting. That's why I'm so emotional. That's why my voice is cracking. Actually, last night, I got to tell you this. My wife called. I call her and say goodnight to her and my daughter, and so I was whispering. She's like, "Why are you whispering? That's so weird." And I go, "Because if I lose my voice tomorrow, I think Jessica is going to beat me severely about the head." So, no, I'm just kidding. So, where are we going? So, what we do know is the inpatient setting represents a kind of a portion of care that's being delivered, but the vast majority of your care is delivered in an outpatient setting. And we recognize that, and one of the problems has been it's a huge black hole in terms of measuring quality, because whether you're dealing with episodes of care from an analytic point of view or you want to look at quality, The data in ASCs are incomplete. The data in physician offices don't reflect an entire episode. So what we're talking about here is, think about this. Think about, as a group of employers, you guys could set up a registry just like providers use today to measure clinical quality around indicators that are important to you. You actually have the ability to do that. There's a CMS has a process that you go through to create a qualified clinical data repository, and you can actually go to providers in which you contract and say, guys, I'd love to get this type of information out of the EMR. It doesn't have to include PHI, to get a sense of what kind of quality outcomes we're seeing at your institution. Oh my word, seriously, an employer would do that. Yeah, you need to do that, because you guys are paying claims for a lot of care in which you have no concept of what the quality is that's being delivered. So I liken it to going down to the grocery store, and my wife tells me to pick up laundry detergent. So I pick up a box, and the laundry detergent boxes all have a different amount of detergent in them, because they randomly fill them from completely full to 5% to 10%. And I just accept. I pay the same price, but I don't get the same value. That's exactly what we're talking about. And this is why quality is so important in your journey as employers. Because we could talk about spend all day long. We can talk about wellness, and costs are vitally important because it's the lifeblood of your business, as are your people. But we've got to begin to ground our conversations in quality and value. So here's what we've been told by CMS, and I don't know if you saw this, but we actually did a study that we released to Fierce Healthcare, and CMS came out with these star ratings, and they talked about taking all of these measures and kind of combining them into a composite score. This is dealing just with the patient satisfaction part of that score. And here's what the Harvard School of Public Health said. They said, you know what? If it's really confusing and you have trouble finding something that you think is quality, just look at the patient satisfaction scores. Okay? So just look and see what the patient's perception of quality is. And so what we did was we said, okay, we're going to look at those institutions that had a 5-star rating. And what we found was that there was no correlation between patients' experience and technical quality. Now, for us in the dork world, we go, duh, right? Because how many of you, do you guys use Yelp? Okay, do you use Yelp to pick restaurants? Okay, so when you use Yelp to pick a restaurant, what's the first question that you ask? When you see like a 1-star rating, the first question I ask is, you know, who is that person, right? Like if they went to Burger King and said, I had a horrible experience, my double Whopper with cheese was way too expensive, I'm not likely to trust that rating, right? So when we talk about patient-reported outcomes, we're not necessarily talking about people that are maybe healthcare literate, and it puts a focus on the fact that there's a huge gap between what we perceive about healthcare and what we actually receive. I've got a great example of this. I had a friend of mine who's actually a little bit younger who had an enlarged prostate. He went in for a biopsy, and he got sepsis from the biopsy. Okay, and so I was sitting there with him in the hospital, so he collapsed, and the doctor comes in, and he said, you know what, so-and-so, he said, I'm sorry. He said, we actually see this in about 5% of the cases, and unfortunately, you're one of the 5%. I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? I go, you got sepsis from a biopsy of your prostate? And he said, golly, that's just kind of bad luck. That's not bad luck, that's bad technique. You should never get sepsis from a prostate biopsy. But he left thinking, well, you know, guess I just had a bad day, you know. And so that's what we're told about our healthcare experience. And then we walk away and go, wow, man, I wish I was in that 95%. So what we found was half of the 5-star hospitals that CMS would say based on patient satisfaction had composite quality scores actually based on their outcomes, mortality, complications, patient safety, core measures, across all their discharges, okay, not just a small subset. So half were below the national 50th percentile for quality when their patient reported satisfaction was a 5-star experience. Okay, that's what your employees perceive about healthcare. They perceive that they're getting quality whether they are or not. And I think that that's dangerous. So granted, this study is based on things that we do in terms of risk adjustment and standardization, but what we found was that you actually had a better chance of receiving a hospital in the top decile nationally for quality for a 2, 3, or a 4-star rating in CMS than you were a 5-star rating. I find that incredibly perverse. You should be incredibly scared about that because your employees might be going to CMS and selecting a hospital that they perceive is a high-quality hospital when they're actually not getting that. And as a matter of fact, if you looked at the percentage of hospitals with scores below the national average, you can see that 47%, so about 140 hospitals of those that CMS as our 5-star hospitals, fell below the national 50th percentile nationally. Isn't that crazy? I mean, y'all, that's crazy. So now you can see why I got so emotional. So how does Pittsburgh stack up? So what I thought would be interesting to do would be to say, okay, you know, we kind of tend to bifurcate Pittsburgh, or, you know, we tend to think about UPMC and Highmark, but let's look at Pittsburgh as a market. And let's look at your market compared to Columbus, Chicago, Dallas, and then LA. So we kind of have some larger MSAs. So these are just at the MSA, so it's not like a secondary service area. And what I did was I created composite quality scores across all the hospitals in the MSA. And what we want to look at is kind of how does the market stack up. So cabbage is what you make coleslaw out of. It's actually coronary artery bypass graft. And so what we're looking at, so how you would interpret this is what we're saying is that when you looked at the aggregate performance across all the hospitals in Pittsburgh, they fell at the 52nd percentile nationally on a risk-adjusted basis, and then standardizing that data for differences in volume, variation, standard deviation, full-on dork stuff. We won't go into that. Columbus, Ohio, which has a large academic medical center, was in the 38th percentile. Birmingham, that's got UAB, huge institution, again, academic center. Dallas, and cabbage. Now, what I can't tell you is, are all these differences statistically different from each other? But again, here, I don't know, my grandmother, some 40 years ago, everybody went to UAB to get cabbage procedures, right? And you were in for like 2 weeks, and then rehab was amazing. So this also represents a strong for-profit presence. So let's look at major joints. Okay, so in major joints, Pittsburgh falls in the 29th percentile, and this is adjusted for, again, volume, variance, risk of patients. So what we're saying here is that 71% of the providers outside of Pittsburgh had statistically more reliable outcomes than the providers inside of the Pittsburgh MSA. What do you think about that? Is that what you read coming into the airport? That's not what I read coming into the airport. Come into Pittsburgh, well, we're in the lower third and we're darn proud. Okay? 23rd percentile in Birmingham, 57th, 43rd, you can read. LA, so that's UCLA Medical Center, large academics. The data, again, has been standardized in a way that I think is credible. Okay, let's look at spine surgery. 25th percentile for spine surgery. Y'all, that is crazy. I mean, seriously, Can you hear my voice getting stronger? I start talking about data, the blood flows, I'm such a dork. So, but you can see, now granted, there's a tendency that when you get some of these large markets, but look at Birmingham, 82nd percentile. I mean, that's amazing. So when you think about what Rick's talking about for a COE strategy, why wouldn't you? I mean, seriously, if the outcomes in the MSA across all the hospitals are in the 25th percentile. Now, I didn't say that you don't have access to high quality here. What I'm saying is at a market. So what we're saying is when you have a PPO, which is called what? A preferred provider organization, preferred being the operative word here, your patients have access to, on average, 25th percentile quality performance. And you're paying $600 billion more for that this year than you did 10 years ago. I think that's a pretty good deal. Oncology. You get the punchline. So that just talked about the average, and that's kind of like, okay, that's kind of stale cake. Let's talk about the range, because that's what really interests me. Because if the range is everybody's at the 25th percentile, then we have a different problem than if I've got a range of somebody being very high and somebody being very low. So let's look at Columbus, Ohio. So this is the highest percentile score in the market that would be available to a consumer. So what I'm saying is for coronary artery bypass graft, the highest performing facility is at the 89th percentile, meaning that all but 11% of the hospitals nationally had lower, less reliable outcomes or less favorable outcomes in that institution. Guess what? That means in Columbus, Ohio, I've got actually access to very high quality care. Would you like to see the lower range? That's a PPO. Because what? We say we value access, right? Which is what we've said for many years, we value access. Access comes at a price. And that price is that if I'm a consumer and I'm going to spine, I can wind up with 92% of all the hospitals nationally delivering better outcomes, or 1% of all the hospitals nationally delivering better outcomes. But the choice is left to me. And that is based on what? It's based on anecdote. It's based on where the physician refers. It's based on where my parents went. That's how we base our decisions, right? So why would we not say, I want to go to those institutions that have highly reliable outcomes that are avoiding adverse outcomes of care? Do you think that there's a relationship between stop-loss claims and avoiding complications of care or adverse patient safety events? Absolutely. No doubt about it. And the risk underwriters are now beginning to look at some of this data. We're in conversations with them. They're saying, okay, we had no idea that you could measure quality. And we had no idea that you could measure quality at a physician level. Think about this. And again, we work with a lot of providers. We work with a lot of providers in your community, and our intent is to become a convener of multiple stakeholders. But I'm telling you that there are providers that need to remediate poor outcomes, and we need to know who they are so that we can challenge them and say, guys, we want higher performance. We want a specification that's going to be met. And we invite you to participate, but you've got to find your way to meet that criteria. Chicago. A very large MSA. Look at that range. Is that not crazy? That's a PPO. So that means that in Chicago, depending upon where I elect to go, I can end up virtually anywhere. DFW, same thing. Los Angeles, same thing. Are you ready? Are you sure? So look at that. Top decile in everything but spine, not top. So what do you think the lower numbers are going to be? Does that concern you? So think about this. You actually have providers that you have availability to, and unless you're being intentional about using information, could be mine, can be somebody else's if it's reliable, you can end up from anywhere from first percentile quality to 98th percentile quality. It's crazy, isn't it? Y'all, that was such a Southern thing, wasn't it? Y'all is your okra fried here? Okay, this is everywhere. It's pervasive. So the key is, how do I begin to deal with this information? So I've got a table here. You cannot read it, but the 3 hospitals that are in the top decile are Advanced Surgical Hospital. This is just for joints. McGee Women's of UPMC in St. Clair, as well as UPMC Presby. They're in the top quartile. We won't read who's in the lowest decile. You can get a copy of this. But what I want you to understand is this is all information that's available through PBGH and has been for several years. And the question that we want to start kind of noodling on is, what is our next step? What is our next step? So now we're actually going to do more. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at not just hospitals, but we're going to look at physicians. And as somebody that has worked with years, worked 4 years with physicians, what I find is that they are healthily inquisitive about information. They're skeptics. They want to challenge content and information and data, and I suggest that they do. And I can tell you that in working with physicians, that we can get them to the point of understanding how all of this is constructed. And this is constructed in the exact same manner to where I can take, for example, Dr. Wendy Poole, and I can, across risk-adjusted mortality, risk-adjusted complications, unanticipated readmissions, one of the things that we're going to be looking at here, which is new, is I can actually now track readmissions to any facility in the community. Used to just be if they went to Hospital A and they were readmitted to Hospital A, I could track them. Now, if they went to Hospital A and they got a deep vein blood clot and were readmitted to Hospital B, I can actually track that as a readmission, not just at the hospital level, but also at the provider level. Inpatient quality indicators, and then these are adverse patient safety events. These are things like postoperative sepsis, postoperative respiratory failure, things that are infrequent but are very costly and drive up your claims cost, and they also will put you into a stop loss or shock loss claim. And what you will find in this market, in addition to other markets, is that you will have a range of percentile scores reflecting quality very similar to this right here. And the goal is not necessarily to be punitive, but as an employer, does it not make sense for me to seek out these providers that are in the top quartile and say, I want them to do my joint surgery? I mean, isn't that natural? I don't go out and say, man, what is the nastiest meal I can get for $5? That's what my father-in-law does. Like, he will not spend over $5, and he'll go, did you know they got all-you-can-eat ribeye for $5 at, so-and-so? And I'll go, why would anyone want to eat ribeye for less than $5, right? It's just kind of counterintuitive. So what we're going to be able to do is to understand where we have variability in outcomes from the quality perspective, and then begin to break that down. So for example, one of the things that we can look at are risk-adjusted complications of care. And one of the things I want you to hear is when the providers say, we're not all treating the same patients, that is correct. We're not treating all the same patients. We're actually treating different patients that bring different comorbid conditions. So we can bring risk-adjusted complications of care. We can measure statistical significance. We can measure significant complications of care. We can also look at an entire service line or entire department. So if we want to look at orthopedic surgery by specialty and look at their performance across different metrics, we're actually going to be able to normalize that data. And that's going to be available through PBGH literally within the next several weeks. We can also look at other general areas of care, so gastrointestinal care, where you have things that range from, let's say, pancreatitis to gallbladders, to open and closed cholecystectomies. And then what I was referring to with respect to a registry, don't you like this diagram? Yes, it's amazing, isn't it? I love it. So anyway, so here's an EHR, and what the federal government has done is they've created a program called MACRA, and what MACRA does is it brings in the SGR fix, what's called meaningful use, which is incenting providers to adopt EMR technology, and then measurement in a program called PQRS. So out of the EHR, they produce these files, and these files go into a clinical data repository. And what we've begun doing with business coalitions across the country is teeing up and saying, guys, this technology here that's being used on the regulatory side gives employers the ability to export data to a registry that has indicators that are relevant to you, because you guys are consumers. And so the larger employers could go to a network of providers or work with bundles or something like this and say, in exchange for this, and we actually have employers that do this, as part of the contract, here are the 15 measures that we want out of these direct contracts. So if we looked at a couple things that you guys are spending money on, endoscopic procedures, and then also colonoscopies. And so these are all indicators of performance that are relevant to a colonoscopy. So if I go into an ASC and my doc said, okay, it's time for your colonoscopy, so there are things that we can measure out of that electronic medical record that you guys would never see because it's non-claims based. So I wanted to pick something disgusting, so I picked adequacy of bowel prep. Because right before lunch, that's kind of the image that you want in your mind, right? You know. So GI Quick is a national registry from the American College of Gastrointestinal Physicians, and so this is simply a description of the measure. Here's why you would want to look at this. So the reason that you would want to look at this is pre-malignant advanced adenomas with suboptimal bowel prep cause a high failure rate. What does that mean? Okay, that means that if people are not prepping themselves for colonoscopy properly and the physician elects to do the colonoscopy, he's going to miss polyps. What do polyps turn into? Colon cancer. Is colon cancer treatable? Is it preventable? Yes. So here's the punchline. Adenoma miss rate is 42% on a poorly prepped bowel for a colonoscopy. 42%. Are you guys paying the bills for poor quality? When that patient says, I'm not going to go back for another couple of years, that was such a pain in the butt, literally. What? Seriously, I can't believe you guys did that. And then advanced adenoma miss rates are 27%. So think about that. So if that patient reschedules for a year or 2 or 3 years out, those polyps have not been dealt with, and the probability of the onset of cancer is high. So this is something that we can actually measure today. Do you think that this is of interest? I think it's very much of interest, because I want to make sure that if somebody is doing something, that they're doing it well. So I wanted to provide an example of how you could bring EMR-based quality reporting into an employer conversation. So these are physicians. This is not data from your market. So this is their NPI. This is their name. We also know their specialty. We can actually pull how many cases had a colonoscopy, what percentage of colonoscopies were indicated with adequate bowel prep, and there are actually specific documentation that you can pick up on, and whether this was statistically significantly high or low relative to the peer group. So if it's in red, what we're saying is that you're statistically lower than the 89% adequacy of bowel prep rate for the Pittsburgh MSA for all colonoscopies. And that if you're in the blue and have an asterisk, that means that you're statistically significantly high. So what this is telling us is something that you would never get on a claim that would prevent the onset of false negatives for colon cancer, and it would reduce your claims cost, converging it with higher quality outcomes. Does that make sense? It sounds so easy, right? So in conclusion, I think some practical steps, and I pulled this from an interesting article from Harvard Business Review. And so the first one is, you know what, you guys have purchasing power. I would suggest that you think of providers and health plans as suppliers. And this is not to denigrate them, and it's not to commoditize them, but it's to establish a relationship based on value. And let me ask you a question. For those of you in manufacturing, if you had a supplier that delivered their products to you that met spec either 99% of the time or 1% of the time, and you didn't know which, would you continue to contract with that supplier to produce your products? We all know the answer to that, don't we? The answer is no, you would not. Then why would you accept that in your health care? In working with employers that have a procurement approach to managing value in healthcare, I highly recommend that. I think the C-suite is misinformed. I think you guys need to define quality in the market with clear specifications, and that's both appropriateness and outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, other things like what's affordable, and then also have demonstrable quality outcomes that are delivered to the membership. I think it's appropriate to set priorities for providers. So we want, not just in the inpatient setting, but there are things that you can do that are highly frequent, uncomplicated clinical conditions that are episodes that can be managed with small changes, making huge differences in value and costs, and then low frequency, unstable chronic conditions. So diabetic, COPD, CHF, those things, all that's been talked about. This EMR-based reporting actually will help you guys get line of sight to that. National reference base for quality and national reference base for pricing. Here's the reality, and Rick, I think, mentioned it. Guess what? Healthcare is not local, and it's not moving in that trend. There are centers of excellence programs in place that cover millions of covered lives. Millions. And patients and HDHPs are more willing than ever to travel if it means that they are getting a higher quality of care and they're having co-pays and deductible waivers. And frankly, I also love the point that if they were left in market, there would be a much higher prevalence of inappropriate surgeries that were not medically necessary. I think you need to think about paying for quality and only quality. And that's it. So, I think we're on time. Does anybody have any questions? Maybe one or two questions? I want to get you guys out on time. Yes, sir. Yes. So in what's interesting is it's an aggregate. So, obviously there are specific areas like, for example, Cleveland Clinic does a great job with heart valve procedures. But for CABG, there are other providers that actually have higher percentile scores. So within each state, you can actually look at different markets within the state. Is that answering your question?
Yeah,
Not real?
I just wondered if it was similar in state. Are things in Pittsburgh similar to Philadelphia?
Yeah, the answer is the general attributes of the markets are very similar in terms of the ranges that we saw and then the mean performance of the market. You have some markets as they get smaller tend to perform either much higher or lower than the mean, but larger markets will tend to approach the mean. What's interesting about Pittsburgh was in the two areas, spine and joints, I think, that you were so far below the national mean means that we're actually not getting the quality care that we would like. Great question. Yes?
Other than a COE strategy, what could we do in this marketplace?
I think of it as, so a COE strategy is a kind of a benefit that you would lay in that would subsidize or underwrite that benefit. I think that there are ways that you can actually direct patients towards higher quality that's available in the market that may not be a COE strategy, but it might be more of a network optimization strategy. So regardless of whether you're with Cigna, Aetna, UPMC, or Highmark, you can actually find the providers that are the most capable at delivering good outcomes in your network, and working through PBGH to do that is what we're actually going to be doing, is providing some resources for you. Then you can work with your advisors to determine how can I underwrite a benefit that might help inform patients about their options and incent them to chase better quality. I would suggest to you that right now, it's probably not being done with a high level of frequency. There's a huge opportunity to move patients towards higher quality providers in the market without creating something that's laborious or kind of challenging from an administrative point of view. Yes, ma'am. Right, great question. So the question was, if you're looking at physician quality, is it impacted by the facility that they're practicing in? Is that a good synopsis? The answer is absolutely yes. So what I find is, when you look at a physician who has privileges across 3 different facilities, you would actually find that their composite quality score would be different at each one of those 3 facilities. So the combination of a hospital and a facility gives you a much greater probability of achieving a higher outcome than just a facility or a physician. It's a great question. There was another question over here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, right now they're not doing anything because it means like we could lose money on this, right? Don't tell anybody. So there are 2 ways that this is going to play. So one is going to be stop loss, and then the other is on medical malpractice, right? Because I've got physicians that are owned that are delivering really high quality care, avoiding outcomes, and their policies don't reflect that. So on the provider side, the providers can go back to their risk carriers and say, guys, I've got an independent third source of data that says that we're delivering high quality. As an employer, what we have seen is kind of the first step is they're willing to discount spend. They're not willing to discount premium. But I think what we could do through PBGH is, in a collective voice, is go back to those that maybe are using a cadre of reinsurance carriers and say, guys, if we have this program, whether it's a COE or a network optimization program, and we can show movement towards higher quality providers, I think that you can build a case that they're going to have to respond to and say, look, we're going to not just discount spend, we're going to discount premium and have a different conversation. But we're going to have to push hard on that, and I'm with you on that. I want to play in that arena because I think it's very important. Yes, sir. I know you.
Shane, since you brought it up, I'm going to trump you on colons. Are you suggesting, before people leave this room, that if you are uncompliant with taking your colon prep, that the doctor should inform us payers and not pay for that employee who didn't do his prep? And or if you got a person with lung cancer who continues to smoke, are we now going to...
Oh, so we're going there, Michael? Is that where we're going? So you see I'm infirmed, right? So no, what I'm suggesting is it probably would be better for the physician to say, you've not done your bowel prep adequately, we're not going to be able to perform the procedure. I'm not saying that it gets reported back to the employer who makes a decision. What I'm saying is I want a proceduralist that will not do a colonoscopy on an inadequately, prepped bowel. Now,
Do we pay that provider because he's
Michael, I'm a dork. I'm not a benefits consultant. But I think the question employers need to ask is, again, what do we do with these things? Because some of the things that are important are going to require courage and disruption, and that is not where everybody kind of wants to go, because it's uncomfortable. But what I'm telling you is, as long as you're content with one of your employees going to the 1st percentile or the 99th percentile, then do nothing. But I'm telling you that this is not new information. We've been having this conversation for 4 years. The question is, are you going to move? You have the basis to move, and I think you can move, and you've got providers to move towards. The question is, how do we best do that? And I think you're always provocative. So with that,